Yacht A. Mark Charles Yinish, yeah. Sin Bake Dinan Nishlin, the Tohiglini Bashachin. Sin Bake Dinan Bashache, do Torjitni Bashanella. Any Navajo speakers in the room? One, two, maybe? So in Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, we're a matrilineal society, matrilineal people, and you have 4 clans, and your identity is your mother's mother. So my mother's mother is actually an American of Dutch heritage, and so when I introduce myself, I say, Tsin Bake Dina'a. Tsin is wood or sticks, Bake is shoes, and Dina'a is people. So I'm of the wooden shoe clan on my mother's side. And my father's clan, my father's mother is Tohiglini. That's the waters that flow together. My mother's father, my 3rd clan, is also Tsinbake Dina'a. And my 4th clan is Todachini, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original 12 clans of the Navajo people. It's one of the largest clans in our tribe. And I wanted to come and speak with you tonight regarding a little bit about a project that I'm working on, but the deeper issue I really wanted to talk about is the issue of reconciliation. So reconciliation right now is a pretty major issue both in our world as well as in our country. Maybe you've been following even today and yesterday about some of the things that are going on in Israel between the Palestinians and the Jewish settlers, and even there's been some deaths and some violence in that area. And our country has a long history of some deep brokenness and some deep brokenness in relationships, both with the African American community, with the Native American community, with the Japanese community, even between some of the different immigrant and European communities that have come here from around the world. There's a lot of problems with unreconciled relationships. And I'm sure all of you even know personally that there are a lot of issues just with maybe roommates or family members, anyone who has any level of relationship, a deep relationship with someone, knows that the potential for misunderstanding or for insensitivity can lead to a broken relationship that needs to be healed or to be reconciled. And then, of course, there's the issue of being reconciled to God, which is one of the reasons all of us are here tonight, which is to understand more about what does it mean to be reconciled with God. And so reconciliation as for Christians is a very important, almost central issue that we need to wrestle with, we need to grapple with, and we need to understand. And I want to share with you just a few stories about some of the things God's taught me about what it means to be a reconciler and what it means to be reconciled. When I was in school, I actually went to school at UCLA, and I was involved with the InterVarsity Fellowship there. Maybe some of you know Doug Schaup, who does a lot of work. He's been here a few times, I think, actually. He was my staff worker. So I was on campus. My freshman year at UCLA was his first year on staff. And so I was there for 5 years and got to know Doug very well. He's a very good friend of mine. And we both have some great stories about each other. I'm sure we could talk about all night if you know Doug, but that's not what I'm here for. But when I was at school, our fellowship actually began to wrestle a lot with the issue of racial reconciliation. We had some African Americans in our fellowship, we had a lot of whites, and at UCLA, of course, we had a lot of Asians. I was the only Native American in the group, and we never really dealt with the issue of reconciling versus Native peoples. But we did wrestle a lot with the issue of especially with the whole African American and white American issues of reconciliation. And the whole time I was on campus there, I thought, these are good things to be talking about. They're nice, and I approve. I like this conversation, but it didn't feel like it was a piece of my faith journey that was central to who I was and what God was calling me to. And after I graduated from school, I actually worked for 2 years with a fellowship, a college fellowship at UNM that partnered with InterVarsity. It was called Southwest Campus Christian Fellowship, and it was a student fellowship focusing primarily on Native outreach and with Native students. And I worked with them for 2 years, and then went around doing some other jobs after that, but eventually moved back to near the reservation in Gallup, New Mexico, and I began preaching in some of the churches around the reservation. And while I was preaching, I got called to pastor a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And this was it was a ministry of the Christian Reformed Church. It had been there for about 25, 30 years at that point. And it was really reaching out to the Native community of Denver. And I accepted this call. I went for the interview, and I preached at the church, and the council called me back a few weeks later and said, we really liked, having you here, and we would like to call you as our pastor. And I had some commitments where I was living that I had to finish up, so I had about 6 months. I said, they called me in like January. I said, I can't come until the summer, until probably May or June, because I have some commitments here I need to fulfill. And they said, that's fine, we'll do without you until then. And so I was in Gallup, and I don't even know how to fully describe it. But one way I can show you or tell you about is, I have 3 children. My wife and I have 3 children. And during the pregnancy that my wife went through with our second child, out of the blue, she just began ravenously craving baked potatoes. I don't know why. Thank God for Wendy's, because I went to a lot of Wendy's during those 9 months. But she couldn't get enough of baked potatoes. And in much the same fashion, after I got this call to pastor this church in Denver, I had this deep, almost unquenchable thirst or desire to understand the biblical call for racial reconciliation. It came out of nowhere, and I don't know even what to attribute it to. It just, I was leading a small group ministry at the church we were attending in Gallup, and I was like, I have to understand the biblical call for racial reconciliation. I said, I don't want to read a book that someone's written about it. I don't want to watch a movie. I don't want to listen to lectures. I don't want to listen to sermons. I want to look at the scriptures and understand straight from the scriptures what is God's call for racial reconciliation. And so I started a small group at our church. And we had about maybe 5 or 6, maybe 8 people. And we met, I forget, for almost the whole 6 months, maybe 4 or 5 months before I left to pastor this church in Denver. And we just did a survey of the Bible. We went through, starting in Genesis, all the way through Revelations, and picked out any passage we could think of or we could find that had anything to do with racial reconciliation. We looked at, the whole story of the Egyptians and with Joseph. We looked at Ruth and Naomi. We looked at Esther. We looked at David and Solomon. We looked at Jesus with the Gentiles and Paul and his ministry to the Gentiles. We looked at passages from Revelation. We looked at anything we could think of that had to do with racial reconciliation. And my whole goal was to understand, what is the biblical call? If we're going to be reconcilers, what is God calling us to? And the definition that I came up with, that we came up with as a group at the end of this 4 or 5 months of going through the scriptures, is this definition. In obedience to God, racial reconciliation is a commitment to building cross-cultural relationships of forgiveness, repentance, love, and hope that result in walking in beauty with your fellow man and God. I'll say that one more time. In obedience to God, racial reconciliation is a commitment to building cross-cultural relationships of forgiveness, repentance, love, and hope that result in walking in beauty with your fellow man and God. So tonight, I'd like to just break out a few components of that definition we came up with and talk about, what does it mean for us, for you as college students, for me as, I guess, a middle-aged man. I don't know what I would call myself. I quit counting at 20, but people tell me I'm 40, so I guess I would have to say I'm middle-aged, or at least approaching that. But anyway, so what does it mean to be reconcilers? What does it mean to live out the biblical call for reconciliation? And the first part of this definition talks about this whole call to reconciliation as a result of our obedience to God. Now, I grew up in a Christian home. I don't even remember when I first asked Jesus to come into my heart. I was maybe 5, 6, 4, I don't know. It was a very young age. I grew up going to Sunday school. I went to a Christian school, 1st grade through 12th grade. You know, I had all the stars by my name on the Sunday school, attendance chart. I knew all the flannel graphs. I could recite the stories to anyone. I knew the answer to all the questions that you were supposed to know. But a strange thing happened, a very challenging thing happened, not a strange thing. My senior year, I was involved in a car accident. And my brother and I were driving to Denver. We were going to my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, and I was driving the car, and we ran off the road between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. We hit a sign, and the car flipped. And my brother died instantly in the accident. And I had a severe and massive head injury. And the way that God saved my life was basically in another car coming in the opposite direction. They saw the accident happen, was a doctor, a nurse, and an EMT. And they knew exactly what to do when they got there. Had they not been there, I would have bled to death in the car. My head injury was that severe. And they told me I was going to have brain damage and I would never fully recover from this. But God, by His grace, allowed me to have a very full and complete recovery. The interesting thing about that accident was about an hour before the accident, we met, my family. We were kind of caravanning together up to Denver. We met in Albuquerque, and we had breakfast there. And I remember eating breakfast. My brother and I then went in my car, and we got gas. I remember getting gas. And then there's a block between the gas station and the freeway on-ramp. And I remember leaving the gas station, and I don't remember getting on the freeway. And then we were almost to Santa Fe, so it was about an hour later when we went off the road and we hit the sign, and the car flipped. And I lose my memory that whole hour, and then it doesn't come back until very slowly a few days later. My memory starts coming back. I was conscious at the site of the accident. They were asking me questions, and I was answering them, but I have no memory of any of this. And so one of the challenging things that this presented to me was I regained my memory slowly, and I don't ever remember the shock value of knowing 1 minute I have a brother and the next minute he died. I don't remember ever going through that moment of terror, of horror, of realizing my brother had passed away. It was more like I woke up slowly from a very bad dream and slowly began to realize the dream was true. And so that first year after the accident, my whole senior year of high school, I kept asking myself, when is it going to hit me? I could talk about the accident like it was something I read in the paper. I could give you the details, I could tell you all the events that I heard about and that happened, but I had no emotional connection to it. And people would say to me, well, when you go back to the scene of the accident and when you see the car, it will probably hit you. And I went back to the scene of the accident, I went and saw the car in the impound, and it never hit me. Then they said, well, maybe at the anniversary of the accident. Well, the anniversary came and went, it never hit me. Well, maybe at your brother's birthday it will hit you. No, it never hit me. And so I graduated and I went off to college, and I got to UCLA, and by then I was pretty much back to normal. I just had never really mourned this tragic loss in my life. And I got to UCLA, and we did something in our Bible studies that I had never done before, which is we would study these passages about, Jesus loving the poor, or hanging out with tax collectors, or healing the sick, or, feeding those who are hungry. We would study these passages, and then the next week we would go out and do those things. So we'd make sandwiches and pass them out to the homeless people of Westwood. Or we'd look and say, who are the people in our realm who are like the tax collectors, who are more outcasts and are outside of the circle, and how can we befriend them and bring them into the circle? And we began doing these things on a fairly regular basis. And I had never done that before. I knew all the stories, but I had never actively sought to apply these lessons in such tangible ways. And like I said, Doug Schaup was one of my staff workers, and so you know his level of excitement and his engagement and just go out and get things like that. And so this was what our fellowship was really learning about. To me, this was really eye-opening, this type of obedience that we were learning. We were very engaged in inductive Bible study, and I was actually going through the Gospel of Mark a few times. I went through it 2 or 3 times while I was in college, the entire Gospel. And we were studying the Gospel of Mark inductively and going through all these things. And then my second year, end of my second year, beginning of my third year, I began dating a woman in our fellowship. And we had... there was no sin involved in our relationship, but the minute I started dating her, emotionally I began to unravel. And what I realized is I didn't realize this till later, but what was happening is this was the first time since my brother died that I allowed myself to care about another person. And it was absolutely freaking me out. I would wake up at night in sheer terror that God was going to strike me dead just for dating her. I would be afraid to leave my apartment. I couldn't study. I couldn't focus on things. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I felt like I was losing my mind. And I decided I had to do something about this, so I withdrew from school, and I was going to get into a Christian, start going through some Christian counseling, because I knew that something was not right, and I had to work through and wrestle through all of these emotions that were suddenly coming up for me out of the blue. And I was leading a Bible study actually in our dorm at that point. I was in one of the halls at UCLA, and I was leading a Bible study in our dorm, but I couldn't continue, and so I withdrew from school. Or I withdrew for the quarter, but they allowed me to stay in the dorm because I was going to come back the next quarter, and I was involved in some leadership there. So the school allowed me to stay in the dorm. And the day I was supposed to start counseling, I was paranoid about it. I was really scared of going into a counselor and talking about all these emotions and these feelings that were going on for me. And that same point, we were doing a bunch of makeup studies for our Mark study, our inductive Bible study in Mark. And if you've ever studied the Gospel of Mark, it's a great book. I love it. Not just because of the name, but it's a fun book to go through it. You know, the whole first half of the book is about the authority and the love and the excitement of Jesus. And then the second half of the book, starting in chapter 8, it goes into some of the depth of what does it really mean to be his disciple, and how do you follow him, and what's the cost of following him. And I was in the study, we were going through the second half of the book of Mark. It was early in the quarter, so we were just getting started, and we had about a 10-day period where we had 3 Bible studies in like 10 days. Normally we'd have them once a week. And the first study we went to, it was in chapter 8, and it was talking about if you want to be first, you need to be last. If you want to be great, you have to be a servant. And we went through this passage, we studied it, we talked about it, and we started talking about applications. And I remember sitting there and praying and thinking to God, God, you're absolutely right. I have to learn how to be a servant. Look at me right now, I'm a mess. I can't even stay in school. God, if you heal me, I will go and do that. I want to learn what it means to be a servant for your kingdom. 4 days later, we come back. Another Bible study, the next passage. Almost the exact same lesson with the exact same application. If you want to be first, you have to be last. If you want to be great, you have to be a servant. Okay, God, you're right. Thanks for the confirmation. I need to be a better servant. God, I'm a mess. Look at me. If you heal me, I will go and do that. Come back 3 days later. Exact same passage, exact same application. By this time, I'm getting a little upset with God. God, I know this. I understand this. I have to be a servant. I'm not a servant right now. I need to learn how to put others' needs ahead of my own. God, but look at me. I'm an absolute mess. I can't even stay in school. You have to heal me, God, and I will go and do that. A day and a half, 2 days later, I was going to start counseling. And I was walking down. I was actually going to meet my girlfriend to talk about some of the things I was going to share with my counselor to kind of process through them in my mind. I was going to meet her on campus to talk about these issues. And I was walking down, and I'm a big fan of I love basketball. I played it all through high school. I coached it after college. I love basketball. And I was walking between the two dorms, between Hedrick and Reber Hall, and I was right in the middle of this basketball court, and I could feel God bringing up these Bible studies in my mind. And I could hear him saying to me, Mark, you have to learn how to be a servant. And by this time, I was fed up with it. I stopped in the middle of the basketball court, and out loud, I said, God, I know you have to heal me, and then I will be obedient. I'm saying this out loud in the middle of the basketball court. And as clear as day, I heard God say to me, no, Mark, you have to be obedient so that I can heal you. I never thought of it that way before. I just stopped in the middle of the court. One of the things we talked about a lot was, who do we reach out to? Who's the odd man out? Who's the people most scared and left out in the college culture? And it's the freshmen. And we had some intentional ways of reaching out to the freshmen, these students who are away from home the first time in their lives and trying to make new friends. And there were several freshmen on our dorm floor who I had been avoiding because I wasn't ready yet. I was emotionally too much of a mess. And so I turned around, I walked up to my dorm room, and I got some of my friends, and we just hung out with some freshmen. I forget what we did, we drank Cokes and played video games or something. But just hung out intentionally as a way for me to begin to intentionally say, I'm going to try and be a servant. And that night I called one of our staff workers who was working in that dorm with us. And I told them what had happened that day on the basketball court. And she said, that's absolutely right, Mark. Oftentimes God calls you to be obedient before he ends up, before you feel ready to follow him. And like I said before, I grew up with all of the stories, with all of the lessons, with all these things in my mind. And the way I would describe it is God pretty much was like my luggage. I would pick him up and carry him around, and I took him with me everywhere I went. But I was the one in charge. I was the one calling the shots. And that day on the basketball court, God became my Lord. And he showed me, no, Mark, I'm the one in charge. I'm the one who's calling the shots. I'm the one who's calling the plays, and you need to be obedient to me. So I'm absolutely convinced of this. One of the first steps that we need to take if we are going to become true advocates for reconciliation, if we are going to pursue a lifetime of reconciliation, is we have to be 100% sold out to Christ. Obedience has to be first and foremost in our mind. Because the ministry of reconciliation is probably one of the hardest ministries you're ever going to be called to. And if you are not completely sold out to Christ and allowing him to be your Lord, and for him to call the shots, and for him to ask you to do things that you don't feel near ready to tackle or to take on, then you're never going to be able to participate in the ministry of reconciliation. We have to learn how to be obedient. And I could tell you many, many stories of how God reinforced that lesson. But that was one of the key first turning points of my life, of really taking the step from Jesus being my luggage and allowing him to be my Lord. One of the second steps of reconciliation that we need to have is we need to understand God's heart and his desire for what his body should look like and what unity really looks like. And that's very challenging for us because we live in a country and we attend churches and we grew up in environments where one of the core values of our nation is assimilation. Who can tell me what assimilation is? Anyone can define that for me?
To bring together.
To bring together, to make things alike. When we did this study at this church on racial reconciliation, this church I attended had Navajos, it had Hispanics, it had white Americans in it. It was a fairly diverse church. There wasn't a lot of conflict, there wasn't a lot of arguing and bickering in the church. And it was easy to stand in front of the congregation and you would see all these different colors of people sitting in the pews and to think, we're doing pretty good. We are racially reconciled. But after we did this study, and the pastor was actually a part of this study with us in this small group, and after we did this, we realized that we weren't actually racially reconciled. We were just assimilated. And the general message we had for people was, if you like to sing this way, if you like to meet this way, if you like this cultural presentation of the gospel, then this is the church for you. If you like a little louder preaching, if you like a little up-tempo beat songs, if you like longer services or shorter services, then you may want to go find another place to worship because this isn't the place for you. And we realized that we weren't fully racially reconciled, we were just assimilated. And our country, one of our core values is assimilation. We have immigrants, refugees, people coming from every corner of this earth. And over time, years, decades, even centuries, they have shed many of the things that make them unique. Their languages, their cultures, their customs, their worldviews, and they've embraced this Western European American worldview so that by and large they could have this thing that we call the American dream. And a lot of the attitude of our country is, if you're willing to come here and learn our language and learn our customs, you're welcome here. If you're not, then this is probably not the place for you. And that's assimilation is one of the core values of our country. And unfortunately, just like my church I was talking about had adopted or adapted assimilation as one of the core values of our church, I think many of our churches across the U.S. have adopted the same value. And if you look closely at the scriptures, you will not find any place that I can think of that I've read where you will find that assimilation is actually a biblical value. And I want to read a passage for you that gets to the heart of what God's desire for his church is. And that's in Acts chapter 2. If you have a Bible, you can look with me. It's in Acts chapter 2. We'll start with verse 1. Let me get to it here really quickly. When I preach in older churches, I always have to explain to people I'm not text messaging when I'm preaching, but I'm actually just reading my Bible off of my phone. But among college students, I think I'm okay. I think you understand that. At least I hope you do. But, so Acts chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what appeared to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not these men who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each of us hears them in his own native language?" Parthians, Medes, and Amalite, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Liberia near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? If you know this story, Jesus had just died on the cross a few weeks earlier. He had risen from the dead, and he had ascended into heaven. He told his disciples to wait in Jerusalem until an appointed time when they would be empowered to go out. So there were about over 100 people waiting in Jerusalem for this to happen. Now God had a challenge in front of him, which is he wanted the entire world to know about his son Jesus. And it happened that at that time in Jerusalem, there were Jews from all over the world. All over the known world, they were in Jerusalem. The problem was they didn't speak the same language. So God's challenge was, how is he going to let all these people know about his son and what he did? The way I see it, he had one of two choices. He could have either allowed the nations to speak the languages of Hebrew or Greek, or he could have allowed his disciples to speak the languages of the nations. Either way, it was going to be a miracle. Something had to happen. And it's so interesting that God chose the latter. Do you ever wonder, what was God thinking? What was God thinking? Language is one of the best vehicles known to us for perpetuating and carrying on culture. If you want to destroy a culture, if you want to decimate a people, one of the first things you need to do is you need to destroy their languages. Our country knew that full well, which is why as they moved native tribes around this country, they assimilated them and they forced us, they punished us for speaking our languages and using our customs. They took native students out of their homes and put them into boarding schools and washed their mouths out with soap if they spoke their native languages. Our country knew full well that if they allowed the language to continue, then the culture would continue and the people would remain strong. But if they destroyed the language, then eventually we would assimilate and become just like the rest of America. So if God was really trying to build a unified church, why would he keep all these different languages? At that moment, God could have established an assimilated language for his entire body. Just think if he would have done that, how much conflict he could have avoided. How much more peace could have resided inside his body if he would have just got rid of all of the cultural differences right then and there and just established a common language for the church. Because that's what God was doing in Acts chapter 2. He was giving birth to the church. One of the key things about God is he absolutely loves diversity. He loves diversity. We see it in this passage and we see it time and time again throughout the scriptures. God loves diversity. When I was a pastor at this church in Denver, I got into my first council meeting. And the council said to me, they said, our last pastor introduced us to the concept of contextualizing worship. And we'd like you to lead us further in that process. And I said, that sounds great. How do you spell it? I had no clue what contextualizing worship was. And they said, well, there's this conference in Hawaii that we want to send you to. It's hosted by the native Hawaiians. It has indigenous tribes and people from all over the world coming together to talk about what it means to be of their tribe and be Christian. And we're going to send you and your family there for 2 weeks to attend this conference and learn about this process. I said, okay, for the sake of the gospel, I will pick up my cross and fly to Hawaii. I don't want to do this, mind you. I'll even bring my bathing suit if I have to. But I'm not going to like it. So I went off to Hawaii, and I got to this conference. And I had been to multi-ethnic conferences before. And I kind of knew what to expect. They would have a multi-ethnic praise band. They would have a guitar. They would have some more exotic drums. And we would probably sing one or two ethnic songs over and over again throughout the conference until by the end of the conference, everybody knew those songs. But most of our worship would be some very similar songs, some very common songs that all of us knew. And I went there expecting this. But I got there, and this conference was like no other conference I'd ever been to in my life. And literally there were tribes, indigenous tribes from all over the world attending this conference. And every night they gave the stage to a different tribe. And they said, you're going to lead us in worship tonight. You tell us what to do, what to sing, how to dress, how to dance. You lead the whole thing. And this conference had been started by a Maori Christian from New Zealand. And in the Maori culture, they have a tradition that's called a haka. Anyone know what a haka is? So when they go off to war, they send their strongest, fiercest warriors ahead of them, and they go before the opposing army, and they do these kind of displays of strength. They take their swords, they take their spears, they take their muscles, and they go in front of the opposing army and they demonstrate them. A, to intimidate them, and B, to show them, if you come any further, this is what you're up against. And when the Christian missionaries got to New Zealand and met the Maori, they saw this tradition and they said, that's pagan, that's evil, you cannot do that anymore. You cannot do the haka. And so one day, this Maori leader who had become a Christian and had given up that tradition of his people, he was watching some of the non-Christian traditional men of his tribe practicing and choreographing this haka. And as he watched them, he said, that looks very similar to putting on the armor of God. Why can't I choreograph a haka that demonstrates putting on the armor of God? And so he did that. And he came to this conference, and the first part of this conference with this worship, he got some of his Maori men up front, and they were going to lead us in worship. And so there were about 5 or 6 of them, and the Maori men are fairly big, and they were standing in front of us, and they're an island culture, kind of tropical, fairly warm, and so their regalia, their traditional dress is not long pants and long sleeves and shoes and socks. You know, it's more of a covering here, and some, you know, maybe some kind of necklace or bone here, and a spear here, and some very large muscles, and some hairy legs and arms, and, you know, a well-fed stomach. And so there's these tribal men standing in front of us, and they said, we're going to lead you in worship. And I thought, well, this should be interesting. And so they stood there, and it was a room probably maybe 2 or 3 times larger than this, and I was sitting towards the back, and they were standing up there, and they had their swords and their spears, and they all were looking very fierce. I can't do it very well, but anyway, they were looking very fierce, and their eyes were big, and they were looking out, and then on cue, they went, ho, 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 ho. And they went on and on for several minutes. Much louder than me, and much scarier than me. And I'm sitting in the back thinking, what is going on here? We're supposed to be worshiping. And it absolutely freaked me out. You know, it's the kind of thing where, like, if we were doing Discovery Channel, I would feel okay about this. But we were worshiping Jesus. And I had never seen anyone worship Jesus in that way before. And I thought, what are these guys doing? You know, you feel like, is this right? Is it pagan? Is it not pagan? I don't understand what they're saying. I don't know what these dances mean. What's going on? And then they said, well, if you would like to learn how to do this haka, you can come up and join us. And again, I'm like, no, thank you. You know, I was pretty freaked out by all of this. And the next night we came back to worship, and we were being hosted by the Native Hawaiians. And the second night they gave the stage to the Native Hawaiians. And there was a woman there who grew up in the hula culture. And so she came up to teach to do hula. And again, if I was watching Discovery Channel, I would have felt right at home. But I've never worshipped to hula before. And it wasn't the hula where you're shaking all around like that. It was more of the graceful. There's two types of hula. And it was the graceful, very, very beautiful type of hula. But I had never experienced that as worship before. And then the next night, the Native Americans came forward. And the next night it was another tribe. And every night it was a different experience. It was confusing. It was chaotic. It was a little freaky. And I just sat in the back and kind of started trying to take all this in and process through it. And I realized I felt very uncomfortable. But the longer I sat there and the more we went on with this conference and the more I experienced this, I began to realize something was happening to me. Which is my understanding and my perception of God was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Because I had always worshipped God from one cultural worldview, one perception, I'd always used the same songs and the same teaching styles and the same length of services. God had become pretty small to me. And now seeing these Maori do the haka, the Hawaiians do the hula, the Native Americans do their drumming, I began to realize God was much bigger and actually much freakier than I ever thought he was. And I began to also realize that, like, for the Maori, they understand God as a warrior better than most people or tribes that I know. The Native Hawaiians understand the grace and the beauty of God better than most people that I know. Native Americans who are contextualizing their worship understand God as a creator and our roles as a steward better than most people that I know. And as we sat there getting freaked out almost every night, we began to see that God was so much bigger than any of us had ever imagined. And it was a very wonderful and a very beautiful thing. And it was experiences like that that helped me understand why Paul, in the book of Corinthians, talks about the body of Christ as a body. And if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul uses the analogy of the body to talk about the church. And he says, for a body to be a body, it has to be diverse. The hand has to be the hand, the eye has to be the eye, the ear has to be the ear, the pancreas has to be the pancreas. If those things aren't unique and separate and diverse, then the body isn't a body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of smell be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of sight be? Paul's basically saying, for a body to be a body, it has to be diverse. And I began to realize that for most of my life, I had lived in this worldview that says for the body to be the body, it means we all have to be the same. Now, in this analogy that Paul uses, what is it that holds the body together? What allows the hand to be the hand and the eye to be the eye and the foot to be the foot? It's the head. It's the soul. And who's the head of the church? Who's the head of the body? It's Christ.